Well, back in the 1920s, there were two great American pastimes. One was baseball, of course. The other, boxing. Every kid knew the great boxers, and not just the heavyweights. Every championship fight was a major event. On September 22nd, 1927, Chicago was host to the biggest boxing match and most controversial bout ever, when Jack Dempsey fought Gene Tunney for the World Heavyweight Championship. It was a fight where one boxer was not counted out at 10. He spent more than 14 seconds down on the canvas, and he still went on to win the fight. Tonight, Chicago Stories takes a look at how it happened. John Calloway narrates the long count.
Chicago, September 22nd, 1927. Babe Ruth is on his way to being the first to hit 60 home runs in a season. But the biggest sports story in the country is a boxing match at Soldier Field. It is a fight promoter's dream. Jack Dempsey, the popular favorite and one-time champion, trying to regain the heavyweight crown from a Shakespeare-reading Marine, Gene Tunney. The seventh round of this match will be the most debated and controversial 3 minutes in boxing history. As the fight is getting underway at Soldier Field, one Chicago kid is already on the edge of his seat.
I'm 15 years old. My brother's about 5, 6 years older. And he and a gang of guys around the neighborhood are gathered around that radio. Graham McNamee is the announcer. There are about 10 of us around the radio listening to the fight.
Ladies and gentlemen, main event for the heavyweight championship of the world.
50 million people heard Graham McNamee call that fight, more than had ever listened to one man's voice.
From Salt Lake City, Utah, former heavyweight king, Jack Dempsey.
We're rooting for Dempsey. His name was synonymous with heavyweight champion, you know. What was appealing about him, he was a bum originally. He rode the rods, rode the trains, couldn't hold jobs. So I think it was the fact that guy rose from us, from the ranks, the blue-collar ones, the kids.
Well, Dempsey was one of the first great sports stars of the 20s. Was bigger than Babe Ruth. It's hard to imagine today, but you're talking about a guy that Babe Ruth was actually jealous of because he was the story, much more so than Babe Ruth. His fights were events. Captains of industry, celebrities, they all came out to watch Jack Dempsey.
They certainly came out to Soldier Field that night. Special planes and trains were chartered from all over the country. Every hotel room in town was booked. 20,000 police officers were on hand to maintain order at Soldier Field.
Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, all friends of Dempsey, all came out.
Most of the hoopla, it seemed, was for Jack Dempsey, and yet Gene Tunney was the world champion.
His opponent from New York City, heavyweight champion of the world, Gene Tunney.
Gene Tunney had won the heavyweight crown from Jack Dempsey the previous year. Dempsey had held the title for 7 years. His legions of fans were not happy to hear that Tunney had won in Philadelphia.
Well, reaction was horror, sadness, grieving. You know, Tunney, who the hell is Tunney? This boxer, light heavyweight champion he was, a good boxer, and he had power, but not Dempsey.
It didn't matter that Tunney was clearly the better fighter in that first fight. People just wouldn't have it. They wanted Jack Dempsey to be champion and grew to resent Tunney just for being a title holder.
But many boxing fans had another reason to dislike Gene Tunney. He came off as an intellectual, reading Shakespeare and talking to the press in formal, pretentious language. When a reporter asked him about an upcoming fight, Tunney acted insulted and insisted that it wasn't a fight, it was a boxing contest.
Most people disliked Gene Tunney because they felt that the intellectual act was more of a put-on, and they just didn't appreciate it. They felt he was kind of above the fray and that he really wasn't one of them. There were even sports writers, I think, that disliked Gene Tunney. He just wasn't the typical boxer.
The irony is, Tunney was an intellectual. And this is George Bernard Shaw, who admired Gene Tunney. He wrote to Bernard Shaw, and Bernard Shaw liked what he said in the letter. Shaw wrote an early play about a boxer, and Tunney said, "You were immature in boxing." And Shaw says, "You're right," and he invited him. And Tunney and he corresponded, discussed Shakespeare, and Tunney met H.G. Wells and the others, and held his own with them. So he actually was an intellectual.
The Philadelphia fight was not only a win for Gene Tunney, but it also made millions for the legendary fight promoter Tex Rickard, the man who built and owned Madison Square Garden.
Tex Rickard was the greatest promoter ever in boxing. Even today, he is Don King times 10. Tex Rickard saw the receipts of the first fight, knew that a rematch would make him even more money, and decided that the most money he could possibly make would happen with a fight in Chicago. They wanted the fight in New York, but New York had a ceiling on how much they would charge for fights. $27.50 was the top price for a ticket. Well, Chicago came a-calling and said, "Hey, we can charge $40 for a ringside seat."
$40 in 1927 would be about $400 today. But when you showed up at Soldier Field with your ringside ticket, you might be in for a surprise.
There were over 100 rows of ringside seats, so just because you had a ringside seat didn't mean that you were right up close for all the action.
Nearly 150,000 people watched the fight at Soldier Field. Another 50 million listened on the radio. At the same time, in a New York armory, a sellout crowd watched another two boxers reenact the Soldier Field fight, blow by blow, as they heard it on the radio. At Sing Sing Prison, death row inmates were granted their final request, a radio to listen to the fight. But the action in the ring was not good news for Dempsey fans.
It was a replay of the first fight. Dempsey was still the second man in the ring, and Tunney's ability was winning him round after round. It really wasn't until the seventh round where Dempsey finally was able to catch up to Tunney. So we're in the seventh round. Dempsey is raining punches on Tunney. Tunney goes down. Dempsey reflexively is hovering over Tunney. Dave Barry, the referee, said, "Go to the neutral corner." Dempsey wouldn't do it at first. He said, "I'll stay."
When Barry comes back to Tunney, he begins his count at 1. But Tunney has already had several seconds to come to his senses. At Barry's count of 9, Tunney gets back on his feet, but he's been on the canvas for at least 14 seconds. Tunney survives the rest of the round by staying away from the raging Dempsey. In the 8th round, Tunney regains the upper hand and goes on to win the fight on a decision. He is the first man to win a fight after being down for 14 seconds. But immediately there's an uproar over referee Dave Barry's long count. Did he follow the rules? Or was this a crooked referee favoring Gene Tunney? At the center of the controversy was an Illinois boxing rule used for the first time in this fight, the so-called neutral corner rule. In the program that night, the rule is clearly stated. When a boxer is knocked down, his opponent must go to the farthest corner and stay there. If he doesn't go, the referee stops the count. But Dempsey's manager insisted that they had the rule wrong, that once Dempsey got to the corner, the referee was supposed to pick up the count with the timekeeper, rather than giving Tunney extra seconds to rest. One reason for the confusion was that the neutral corner rule was still so new.
Prior to the neutral corner rule, when a fighter would go down, the other fighter left standing was able to hover over an opponent and hit him even as he was trying to get up.
In fact, the neutral corner rule was created because of Jack Dempsey.
Jack Dempsey, in all of his fights, if you ever look at his earlier fights, he not only stood over his man, Dempsey would sneak around him so the guy couldn't see him. And the minute he got off his feet, Dempsey would boom, like he did with Willard, and then he'd go upstairs.
In Chicago, Dempsey may have been hovering over the fallen Tunney, but he still knocked him down, and Tunney was on the canvas for at least 14 seconds. More than a few Dempsey fans wondered if referee Dave Barry might have been influenced to favor Tunney. Barry had been chosen as referee by the Illinois Boxing Commission just that morning, after questions were raised about the intended referee, Dave Miller.
Everyone in boxing pretty much agreed that the person that should be refereeing the rematch would be Illinois' Dave Miller. A fine referee. One problem, Dave Miller's brother had a sizable bet of over $50,000 on Jack Dempsey to win. Once that became public, people felt that that wasn't proper and that Miller would have a betting interest in one of the fighters. So instead, they decided to choose Dave Barry. It's odd that they chose Dave Barry because Barry ran a speakeasy, so in effect was kind of a criminal.
Dave Barry owned a speakeasy, owned a house of ill repute. Allegedly, I don't know, I never knew the man, but from what I read, he was a bad character.
And some people even asked and said, what are you doing making a criminal referee this fight? And they said, well, you don't have to worry. Barry isn't connected to Capone, so he's not going to have any allegiance, so he's an honest crook.
But the fact that Dave Barry wasn't connected to Capone didn't mean he couldn't have been influenced by someone else. Al Capone was a big Dempsey fan, and it was widely known that Philadelphia mob boss Max Boo Boo Huff preferred Gene Tunney. There was never any hard evidence to prove that Dave Barry was influenced by Huff or anyone else. But after Barry's long count in the 7th round, some think the 8th round looks pretty suspicious.
In the 8th round, at the beginning, Tunney cracked off a right hand and Dempsey went down, and Dave Barry, seemingly forgetting about the neutral corner rule, immediately jumped in and started counting 1. Gene Tunney wasn't in a neutral corner. Gene Tunney was 3 feet away from Dempsey. He was ready to attack, much in the same way that Dempsey was in previous fights. So people wonder, there was a long count in the 7th round, but there seemed to be a quick count in the 8th round.
There's a lot of pressure on a referee in a fight, in a big fight like that. What were there, 110,000 people there? Oh, sure. Probably slipped his mind.
In the end, the Illinois Boxing Commission supported Dave Barry, and Gene Tunney kept his crown. But if Tunney hadn't gotten the long count, could he have gotten up in time?
Tunney has always maintained that at the count of 2, he knew exactly where he was, but also had enough of a mind to realize that he needed that additional count up to 8 to regain his legs and take a rest.
If Dempsey would have went to the corner right away, Tunney would have got up at 9. He would have had a much harder time getting away. Could Dempsey have caught him? And, the condition Tunney was in, it wouldn't have took 7 punches to put him down that time. He would have just maybe took 1. Dempsey would have won, there would have been a rematch. And Tunney would have won the rematch.
As frustrating as that 7th round was, if you look at the fight in balance, there was no question. Tunney was the better boxer.
Promoter Tex Rickard, of course, wanted a Dempsey-Tunney rematch, and the public was clamoring for it. The only two who didn't want a rematch were Dempsey and Tunney. Gene Tunney fought and won one more title match, but without the star power of Jack Dempsey, it didn't make much money.
By that time, Tunney had become attached to Polly Draper, his fiancée, a member of the Carnegie Steel family. And Polly Draper, the last thing she wanted was a sweaty heavyweight champion for a husband. So the decision was made, if Tunney was going to make it into the Draper family, the boxing career was going to have to go. Tunney had made more than enough money in boxing, so he didn't mind retiring, and was marrying into a very wealthy family as well, so didn't need to fight anymore, so Tunney retired.
Jack Dempsey never fought another championship bout, but his popular New York restaurant kept him in the public eye.
Dempsey became popular, he said, when he left the ring in Philadelphia and everybody started cheering him. And then he became even more popular, he said, because of the long count. He's glad he didn't win that fight because he became more popular by that long count, and if he would have won the fight, he would have went on to fight again, and he would have probably got knocked out and would have been as popular.
For losing the fight, Jack Dempsey received a $450,000 purse. Gene Tunney was supposed to get $990,045. But Tunney wanted to be the first athlete to get $1 million. So he gave promoter Tex Rickard a check for the difference, and Rickard cut him a $1 million check. That check, by the way, is on display at the Chicago Historical Society.